Hello and welcome to my channel. Last month I published a video about the life of Thomas Nash. I had read parts of his and Gabriel Harvey's works, but in order to understand more about this and the London writers' scene in general, I thought I should start at the beginning with Nash's first published work. Instead of doing a load of studying and presenting a conclusion, I am inviting you all to join me on this journey of discovery. It would be great if you could read the Anatomy of Absurdity yourself, but if you haven't got the time, I'm going to take you through it. I'm using Mackerrow's Works of Thomas Nash to help me. There are no chapters in the book, so I have divided the book into themes. Dedicated to Charles Blount, Knight. Charles Blount became Baron Mountjoy in 1594 and was bestowed with the title Earl of Devonshire by James I after defeating Tyrone at the Battle of Kinsale. He was married to Penelope Rich. From 1586 to 1591, Charles Blount was taking part in military operations in the Low Countries. Mackerrow says it is difficult to see how Nash would have had any connection to him. Blount had a reputation as a patron of literature. As Nash never mentions him again, it is unlikely that his dedication was a success. Nash says in his epistle, "It is not long since, lighting in company with many extraordinary gentlemen." Nash came to London in 1588. He says it was his chance to talk about diverse questions of the several qualities required in Castiglione's courtier, that is, the Book of the Courtier by Balthazar Castiglione. One came in with Ovid, always be lovable. Another stood on the necessity of affability and humour. The third came in with his carpet devices, play the citern, lute, to dance delicately and revel it bravely. The fourth, as an enemy to their faction, confuted all these effeminate follies and maintained the only adjuncts of a courtier were scholarship and courage. We could try and work out who these four gentlemen were, but I think that Nash is talking allegorically. Nash states that the epitome of the English courtier was Sir Philip Sidney. It might truly be said, arma virumque cano, I sing of arms and the man. Nash then goes on to compliment Charles Blount, I think in hopes of patronage. Myself, being idle in the country, begin this vacation the foundation of a trifling subject, which might shroud in his leaves the abusive enormities of these our times. In the introduction to Green's Menaphon, he advertises this book, saying, "My Anatomy of Absurdity may acquaint you ere long with my skill in surgery, wherein the diseases of art are merrily discovered." Nash begins by criticising the vacuous authors of many pamphlets flooding the booksellers, silly romances released for profit, not literature, representing women as lusty maidens with their loose morals. Nash says, not remembering, as there was a loyal Lucretia, so there was a light Lovelace. As there was a modest Modulina, so there was a mischievous Medea. As there was a steadfast Timoclea, so there was a traitorous Tarpeia. As there was a sober Sulpitia, so there was a deceitful Scylla. As there was a chaste Claudia, so there was a wanton Claudia. I am reminded of Mere's Pallades Tamia. I know that there hath been an unchaste Helen in Greece, so there has been also a chaste Penelope. As there hath been a prodigious Pasiphae, so there hath been a godly Theocrita. Though many have desired to be beloved as Jupiter loved Almena, yet some have wished to be embraced as Phrygius embraced Piera. As there hath reigned a wicked Jezebel, so hath there ruled a devout Deborah. Mears has copied this quote directly from Lilly and inserted it into his chapter on women. Whereas there is some alliteration in Lilly's passage, Nash has taken it to an extreme. Nash uses as so comparisons, and then goes on to provide a series of quotes from the ancient philosophers. Only doesn't. Maquero was not able to find the quotes. You might think that the original source of the quotes might be lost, but from my reading, the philosophers that Nash quotes seem unlikely to have said these things, as Nash quoted them. Nash quotes, and I'm putting in inverted commas, what ancient philosophers such as Aristotle, Diogenes, Pythagoras, Socrates, Demosthenes, Democritus, Plutarch, Seneca, and Marcus Aurelius said about women. None of it good. Maquero was only able to find one of the quotes from these philosophers. My friend Joe and I had the same result when we did an internet search. The only one I could find was the one from Diogenes that Maquero found. Questioner: when is the best time to take a wife? Diogenes: for the young man, not yet, and for the old man, never. I did find similar quotes. Plautus saith that women deck themselves gorgeously and lace themselves so nicely because foul, deformed things seek to set themselves out sooner than those that are for beauty more amiable. Plautus actually said of a certain lady, "She's no dressed if she's badly mannered. Ill breeding mars a fine dress more than dirt." I think Nash provides a clue that it is not an actual quote, because women in ancient Rome did not lace themselves as they did in Nash's day. Nash paints a picture that women cannot be trusted at all. Like Eve, they are responsible for original sin. The philosophers quoted seem to give a much more balanced view on the qualities of women and wives. And although some of their views may seem misogynistic today, those who spoke about marriage talked about it as a partnership that required work on both sides. Nash seems to take a part of a quote, but then twist it. He says, Aristotle does counsel us rather than get a little wife than a great, because always a little evil is better than a great, so that he has counted all women, without exception, evil and ungracious. Aristotle did talk about a great and little evil, but did he take the extreme view that all women are evil and ungracious? I doubt it. It seems that Aristotle, who was married, had a high regard for women. Mears says, as Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle affirmed that women were fickle and inconstant. Nash supposedly quotes from Plutarch. The reason why men fail so often in choosing a good wife is because the number of them is so small. Mears quotes, as no man knows where his shoe rings him, but he had it on. No man knows the disposition of a woman, but he that has married a wife. He finishes this series of quotes from ancients by an author of late memory. They carry angels in their faces to entangle men, and devils in their devices. This is possibly from Gascoigne's Steel Glass. Behold, my lord, what monsters muster here, with angels' face and harmful hellish hearts. After a couple of pages of Latin quotes translated into English, Nash then compares women to shape-shifters, like Jove. This passage, originally taken from Golding's translation of Ovid's Metamorphoses, also appears in a similar form in Lilly's Euphues. Did not Jupiter transform himself into the shape of Amphitryo to embrace Salamina, into the form of a swan to enjoy Leda, into a bull to beguile Jo? From John Lilly, talking about love. Then from Nash talking about women. They have more shifts than Jove had sundry shapes. To Danae he came in a shower of gold, to Leda in the likeness of a swan, to Jove like a heifer. Jove, otherwise known as Jupiter, took different shapes. Nash says to Jove, he took the shape of a heifer. Lily says he changed into a bull to beguile Joe. This differs from the original story in Metamorphosis, where Jo herself was changed into a cow. Bond notes that Jo is an error for Europa. Nash then describes ancient customs and superstitions to guard against a wife's infidelity. After 15 pages of criticism of women and wives, Nash shifts his narrative to praise of women by amorous courtiers. As Paris favoured Aphrodite and gave her the golden apple, so poets began producing pamphlets in praise of their mistresses, to be called the restorers of womankind. But idle heads are usually occupied about some trifling texts. Wanton wits are combed with wanton fits. Such busy brains sow where they reap small gains. Nash seems to have begun writing a pamphlet about women and wives, seemingly taking quotes from ancient philosophers to show how terrible and evil women are. I think his intention is to contrast this with modern poets such as Sir Philip Sidney, who have gone beyond praising women for their natural qualities to comparing them with goddesses. So he presents 15 pages critical of women, then he moves on to the praise of women. He begins with the story of the judgment of Paris, says, I say no more, you know the rest. The wiser can apply it. He writes 5 more sentences on the praise of women by poets. Then, as if he has become bored by the topic or distracted by other matters, he moves on to a different topic. In his epistle, Nash mentions Philip Sidney, who died 2 years earlier. He might have been thinking to continue in this vein of criticism of poets, like Sidney, praising women beyond all worldly attributes, but realises this might cause offence to the highly influential family who are known to patronise poets. So he moves on to a different topic, and then says, I leave these in their folly and hasten to another man's fury. I leave these in their folly and hasten to another men's fury, who make the press their dunghill, where they carry all the muck of their melancholic imaginations, pretending forsooth to anatomise abuses and stub up sin by the roots. An obvious reference to Philip Stubbs' Anatomy of Abuses. Hibbard tells us that the Anatomy of Abuses was the most successful of the Puritan books and had gone through 4 editions by 1885. As the stage player is ne'er the happier because he represents oft times the persons of mighty men, as of kings and emperors, so I account such men never the holier because they place praise in painting forth other men's imperfections. The Martin Marprelate Puritan texts began appearing in 1588. The first Martin pamphlet, the Epistle, is written in response to a defence of the government established in the Church of England by John Bridges, Dean of Salisbury, which was written in response to earlier published Puritan works. I think that Nash may be commenting on the authors of religious pamphlets in general, but particularly Puritans. These men seem learned to none but idiots with a coloured show of zeal. I know not how it delighteth them to put their oar in another man's boat, and their foot in another man's boot. They wallow in shallow water. The sum of their divinity consists in 2-penny catechisms, inquiring most curiously into every corner of the commonwealth, correcting that sin in others wherewith they are corrupted themselves. A common practice it is nowadays, which breeds our common calamity, that the cloak of zeal should be unto a hypocrite instead of a coat of mail, a pretence of purity, gloss of godliness, a covert for all naughtiness. What politic counsellor or valiant soldier will joy or glory in that some stitcher, weaver, spendthrift, or fiddler hath shuffled or slubbered up a few ragged rhymes? These rude rhythmos with their jarring verse alienate all men's minds from delighting in numbers' excellence. Nash prefers poetry with divine numerical structure, a hidden philosophy, a sweetness of verse and variety of invention. Then I think he sums up his own philosophy for all his writing. True things are rather admired if they be included in some witty fiction, like pearls do delight more if deeper set in gold. In this phrase, Nash is giving us a clue that anything he says is fiction, containing hidden truths. He begins the next thought. As these men offend in the impudent publishing of witless vanity, so others overshoot themselves in another way. Nash asks the question, which he says is an old question: is it better to have moderate affections or none at all? The Stoics said none. Nash is a professed peripartitian, mixing profit with pleasure. He says these others would cast away the nut for mislike of the shell. Nash is saying that there are important truths in fables and stories. Even though Nash praises Virgil's unchaste Priapus or Ovid's obscenity, he says, I commend their wit, not their wantonness, their learning, not their lust. Even as the bee out of the bitterest flowers and sharpest thistles gathers honey, so out of the filthiest fables may profitable knowledge be sucked and selected. Nash says that young men should be protected from such ribald texts, that pornographic texts have a corrupting influence. Even though such texts might contain pearls of wisdom, young men are not mature enough to discern this before they are poisoned by the erotic trappings. When the endeavour of youth shall prove naught else but the exercise of all abuses, sex, drugs, and rock and roll. Good counsel is never remembered or respected till men have given their farewell to felicity and have been overwhelmed in the extremity of adversity. Young men think it a disgrace to youth to embrace the studies of age, counting their fathers fools while they strive to make them wise, casting that away at a cast of a dice which cost their dads a year's toil, spending that in their velvets which was raked up in a russet coat. Nash is saying that a father has worked hard to provide his son the opportunity to go to college, even though he can only afford to wear simple clothing, i.e. a russet coat. His son, dressed in velvet, squanders money that it has taken his father a year to earn. The father striving to make his son wise, while the son thinks his father is foolish. Nash, a young man of 21 years of age, is speaking as if he is older and wiser. Nash left Cambridge before he finished his master's degree, supposedly being forced to leave because he wrote a scurrilous play. As Maquereau sees no evidence that Nash was expelled, he thinks that Nash may have been forced to leave following the death of his father, who was providing financial support. When as wits of more towardness have spent time in the university, and have, as it were, tasted the elements of art, and laid the foundation of knowledge, if by death of some friend they should be withdrawn from their studies, as yet altogether raw, and so consequently unfitted for any calling in the commonwealth, where should they find a friend to be unto them, instead of a father, or one to put that which their deceased parents began? When the outward garment, not the inward virtue, must fain commend a man, knowledge and learning makes the children of the poor to become noble, the equal of princes in possessions, deriving their kindred from the coffer, not the conquest. Nash says, I do not speak this to the derision of the virtuous nobility, which I reverence in each respect. Nash sees the change in society, where it was possible previously to rise from poverty, like Thomas Cromwell did. He thinks that now it is more difficult to get a full education without financial backing. Nash left the university without finishing his master's degree. William Covell, in Parliamentea 1595, saying of Nash, Thou hast been unkind to wean him before his time. Without financial backing, Nash says, some turning to teaching when they should be taught, and others taken to the pulpit, their knowledge being yet imperfect. Then he speaks of preachers who haven't fully established their religious education before they become zealots. This green fruit, being gathered before it is ripe, is rotten before it be mellow. It is a common complaint that more perish with a surfeit than with a sword. This is a quote taken from Euphues' England. Nash discusses bad diet and too much wine. It was seen as virtuous to live on bread and water rather than a varied diet. Nash argues that it doesn't matter if one eats various types of meat and drinks various wines, or only one type, but it is the amount one consumes. This seems like a prelude to Piers Penniless, Supplication to the Devil, and the 7 deadly sins. Nash is warning students and says, What is this but to imitate the foolish tender mother, which had rather a child be well fed than well taught? We have a want of wisdom when we observe no method in reading. Some things we read, lest we should seem to be ignorant in them. Other things we read, not that we may embrace them, but eschew them. If thou be desirous to attain the truth of a thing, first learn determinate conclusions, before thou dealest with doubtful controversies. Many make toys of their study. Having left the fountains of truth, they follow the rivers of opinions. And thus we end our summary of Anatomy of Absurdity. Let's begin our analysis with the title. The word anatomy was used to describe a skeleton, dissection, or investigation. Therefore, the title is thought to mean an investigation of absurdity. It was a common form of title. Some examples include 1556 by Anthony Adamo, an anatomy, that is to say, a parting in pieces of the mass. 1576, Thomas Rogers' Anatomy of the Mind. 1583, Philip Stubbs' The Anatomy of Abuses, and Robert Greene, The Anatomy of Lovers' Flatteries. It was stated that Nash plagiarised the title from Stubbs, while Grosart thought it more likely that he took it from Greene. McKerrow thinks it is more likely that Nash, after reading Lilly's Euphues, likely chose the title as a counterpart to Lilly's Euphues, The Anatomy of Wit, very pleasant for a gentleman to read and most necessary to remember. The Anatomy of Absurdity says, no less pleasant to read than profitable to be remembered. The Anatomy of Absurdity was entered into the Stationers' Register on the 19th of September 1588. There was only one edition printed, first in 1589 and again in 1590. Anatomy of Absurdity, containing a brief confutation of the slender imputed to feminine perfection, with a short description of the several practices of youth and sundry follies of our licentious times. A brief confutation of the slender imputed praises to feminine perfection. Almost half the book is about women. I suspect that he wrote this while at university. It might almost have been called The Anatomy of Women, which would have suited Nash's sense of humour, punning on the physical attributes and his dissection of their character. We've already compared the as-so passages to the one taken from the chapter on women from Palladi's Tamia. If I didn't know that Palladi's Tamia was published almost 10 years after Anatomy of Abuses, I might have believed that Nash was imitating it. Nash graduated Bachelor of Arts in 1586 from St John's College, Cambridge. A year later, Mears received a BA from Pembroke College, Cambridge, and an MA in 1591. Mears devotes 2 paragraphs to Nash. As Eupolis used great liberality in taxing the vices of men, so doth Thomas Nash. And after getting into trouble with the Isle of Dogs, Mears says, "Be not disconsolate, gallant young juvenile. Comfort thyself, sweet Tom." Is it possible that the 2 men knew each other at Cambridge? There is no real evidence they did. Some believe that Mears began his Palladi's Tamia while at university. I wonder whether Palladi's Tamia and Anatomy of Absurdity were begun as exercises in rhetoric, written as part of their degree course at Cambridge. Of course, Nash doesn't finish his master's degree. I suspect that after leaving uni, Nash continues with his anatomy. Either he became bored with the topic of women, or decides that he's not going to spend too many words criticising those who praise women, so he abruptly changes topic. Criticism of poets who praise women might lose him patronage. It might be far more profitable to get involved in the topic of the time, the criticism of pamphlets and preachings of the Puritans. Mears faithfully reproduces quotes in his Palladi's Tamia, whereas Nash subverts his. Looking through Macaro's notes on the anatomy, it seems that most of the quotes in the section on women cannot be found. Nash paints a picture that women cannot be trusted at all. Like Eve, they are responsible for original sin. The philosophers quoted seem to give a much more balanced view on the qualities of women and wives. And although some of their views may seem misogynistic today, those who spoke about marriage talked about it as a partnership that required work on both sides. Nash seems to quote something similar to what they said. For example, Seneca spoke on ignorance, but did he say there be 2 especial troubles in the world, a wife and ignorance? Nash says, Aristotle does counsel us rather than to get a little wife than a great, because always a little evil is better than a great, so that he has counted all women, without exception, evil and ungracious. Aristotle did talk about great and little evil, but did he take the extreme view that all women are evil and ungracious? I doubt it. Mears says that Aristotle affirmed that women were fickle and inconstant. Ironically, later in the Anatomy, Nash criticises young people who take extreme views when learning and wisdom lead to mellowing and moderation. I have looked carefully at the quotes in the first half of the book. Then from the second part of the book, I just chose one completely at random. Nash says, "Heed what Chrysippus saith in his Proverbs. That which thou knowest not, peradventure thy ass can tell thee." Macaro says, "I have been unable to find this, or indeed any Proverbs, in inverted commas, of Chrysippus." Chrysippus did write many pithy quotes scattered throughout his writings, which his opponents accused him of stealing from others. But I think what Macaro is referring to is a collection entitled Proverbs of Chrysippus. Chrysippus died after drinking too much wine at a feast. Observing a donkey eating figs, he said, "Now give the ass a drink of pure wine to wash down the figs." Chrysippus then died in a fit of laughter. So there is a grain which compares to the original quote. Is Nash using his philosophy that true things are rather admired if they be included in some witty fiction, like pearls to delight more if deeper set in gold? There are too many of these misquotes or mistellings of stories not to have been deliberate. I wonder whether Nash was playing a game to try and sort out the wheat from the chaff. I don't know how people read it at the time, whether the fake news was believed, ignored, or whether it was just so obvious that people understood it as a joke. Gabriel Harvey seems not to comment on it. McKerrow believes that Harvey never read Nash's Anatomy, but I did find an allusion to abuses in Harvey's 4 letters. Sir Stanley Wells had little to say about the Anatomy of Absurdity, other than it was his least successful work, not reprinted in his lifetime. Unsuccessful it may have been, but McKerrow tells us that it had a reprint a year after the original publication. There was one edition, some copies dated 1589 and some 1590. Hibbard tells us that early in the reign of Queen Elizabeth I, there was a return of Protestants who had fled to the continent during Mary I's reign. The Pilkington brothers became masters of St. John's College, John from 15 to 1561 and James from 1561 to 1564. They were both Puritans. The attempts to root out Puritanism from St. John's from the 1570s and early 80s were unsuccessful, when William Whitaker took up mastership in 1586. Hibbard suggests that this may be a reason that Nash left Cambridge. As the son of a clergyman, he might have been expected to follow his father, but he did not fit into the college with strong Puritan leanings. He says that Anatomy of Absurdity is very much a young man's work and has little literary merit, saying that Nash purveys platitudinous moral advice with the brash readiness of inexperience. Even though Nash advertised this book as merry, Hibbard says this claim is bogus and the book is drearily dull. He says the piling up of instances, the elaborate alliteration, the use of rhyme, the references to mythology all point to the same model. Nash is using the same methods that he criticises in other writers, but without the same finesse as others. Hibbard also says that McKerrow shows conclusively in his notes that Nash is guilty of plagiarism. He says the book is dreary because it has merely been taken over without undergoing any radical change at all. I would somewhat disagree with Hibbard. There is enough evidence in McKerrow's notes to show that Nash is not just copying quotes from other writers. In some instances, he does radically change them, but in a way that shows lack of maturity. Hibbard says that in later works, Nash makes second-hand material his own by jazzing its phraseology to give a new and exciting appearance, or by relating it to the life he knew. I suspect that Nash is attempting this in Anatomy, but is not quite hitting the mark to make this cutting satire. Hibbard describes it as a sword sheathed in cotton wool. And finally, let's address the elephant in the room, even though I hate that expression. Taking Anatomy of Absurdity alone as evidence, was Nash a pseudonym for the Earl of Oxford? Robert Proctor's main argument on the Anatomy is that a young man of 19 or 20 years old would not have been able to dazzle the reader with a parade of classical learning. He cites the dozens of books by Latin and Greek authors, as cited by McKerrow. Proctor also gives a long list of contemporary authors that Nash would have had to have read, and claims that a young man from a small fishing village would not have had access to so many texts. Even if Nash had access to all these books, would he have had the experience to absorb these texts and then be able to use them to become proficient in the euphuistic style? Without having direct knowledge of all the writers quoted, it is difficult to argue with this. But reading through McKerrow's notes on the Anatomy of Absurdity, Volume 4 of his series, you get a sense of how many times McKerrow says things like, "I was not able to find this," or "this quote from Erasmus is taken from Lilly," or "this story seems to be well known at the time," or this quote was taken from Textos Officina, a book of quotes from many writers used, by the way, extensively by Mears. So quotes from many authors can be reduced to a fewer number of books that quote other writers. And there were a lot of these books at the time. So much so that James I later banned students of the universities from using them. It would be like writing an essay and only using Wikipedia as a source. If we believe what Nash says about himself, he left Cambridge University, then spent some time in the country writing this book. Then he came to London, where he met other writers. As a student in Cambridge and while studying in the country with some unknown person, he may have had access to loads of texts. I'm not qualified to say whether Nash was proficient in the euphuistic style in this book, but it is clear that he is trying to imitate Lily. I believe that Oxford was too well read to make so many mistakes in the quotations. But then I think it's unlikely that the author would have made so many mistakes. It seems deliberate. That the work seems to show similarities with Pallades Tamia makes me think that it might have been an exercise in writing, which the students at the university did as part of their course, unless the writer was familiar with Mears, imitating his commonplace book and satirising his chapter on women, which I think would be more likely for a university student contemporary with Mears than an older peer of the realm. The author, whoever he was, seems like an emotionally immature single man, who either dislikes women in general or has been hurt by a woman. Oxford's wife died in 1588. It seems unlikely to me that he would write such a diatribe on women and wives soon after her death. Even though the marriage had its difficulties, Oxford seems to show remorse when she died. He obviously wasn't put off by women or wives in general, because it wasn't long before Oxford married again. We have so little biographical information on Nash, but there is no evidence that he was ever married. The author speaks with the authority of someone older and wiser while coming across as immature. He seems to have experienced university life and is concerned with the folly of university students. Oxford, as Shakespeare, seems more concerned with the folly of courtiers. Even in Love's Labour's Lost, the students are courtiers, not typical Cambridge students. The general opinion of Anatomy of Abuses is that it is not great literature, and there is little to commend it. I think it is very unlikely to have been written by Oxford, but let me know what you think. Next time, we will be looking at a far more interesting work by Thomas Nash, which seems to have stronger links to Oxford. I hope you have enjoyed this dive into the Anatomy of Absurdity. I hope it has revealed something about the author. Thank you for watching. Please subscribe to my channel and press the bell icon to be informed of the next video. Leave a comment below. I don't mind if you disagree, but remember, please be kind.